Well, here's my sketch, and as you can see, it's fairly loose, but the main details are there. The main values are there as well, so that's important. So I'll try to replicate um, the detail as well as some of the values. Now, it's kind of hard to do with this pen. This pen is filled with golden acrylics, high flow acrylics, and this particular color is called indigo blue. It used to be called anthraquinone blue, and I think indigo blue is a better name. It's an odd kind of a blue. It's got a lot of covering power, as you can see there, but it can be also very transparent, and it's kind of hard to describe. It has a little bit of grayness to it. It isn't quite as high chroma as phthalo blue, for example. But I really like it a lot. This is the first time I've ever used this color actually for an underpainting, so it'll be a bit of an experiment. Now, one thing I might have done differently is I might have put a wash of indigo blue over the whole thing after I got the drawing in. Now, that line I just put on the top of the bush there has a lot of variety to it, and I really like it a lot. Now, as the painting goes along, I start putting the paint in, and I lose some of that variety. So you have to kind of be careful that you don't, lose some of the really, important detail in your sketch. So this pen really can scrub the color on really quite nicely. You can just use a corner of it, and you can get a very thin stroke. So it's really nice. I love these pens, and the golden high flow acrylics, they're very good. It's almost like an ink. I mean, it's so thin, it's amazing. And yet, you can see it's covering quite nicely too. So I'm still, just looking at my sketch, trying to get all the important detail, and if I can, actually make the sketch look better. So I'm really asking a lot of questions as I'm sketching. I'm trying to use the sketch as a point of departure for an even better sketch on my canvas. So that's the goal, and sometimes you hit it and sometimes you don't. Sometimes you'll make a decision to include a detail that was maybe not that important, or created some kind of a focal point or something that sort of detracted from your original vision, so you have to kind of go back in and change that. But now you can see I can use that pen just very lightly, and it sort of gives a very dry brush effect. So it's these things are great. I mean, there's a great invention, whoever came up with them. So I'm just kind of adding, detail here and there, adjusting the value just slightly. If you have a nice sketch, you can get a good sketch on your canvas, and you try to use each phase of the painting process as a way to leverage the next layer. You might say that each phase of the painting is inspiration for the next phase. So you don't want to scrimp at any point. You don't want to say, that's good enough. Now, I did radically change these reflecting lines. These are where the water might be moving a little bit faster or something, or there might be some wind hitting it, and it'll be sort of making little ripples, and it'll pick up the sky color. But I sort of decided that they were a little bit too stylized, and that I needed to go with a more naturalistic looking ripple effect. I like to stylize when I can, but sometimes it just looks a little too stylized, and you need to get something a little more realistic. So what I did was I just got on the internet, and I looked at some photos of water. I mean, I didn't copy it. I just sort of used it as inspiration. So the one thing I would like to point out is this is primarily a sketch that I've done from memory. I've seen similar scenes to this, and I'm simply making a composite drawing based on a lot of different memories I've had of being on the water. I love being on the water, and I take a lot of sketches and photos when possible. And so primarily this is from memory. This is kind of a project I've been involved in just recently, is trying to get more of a stylization into a sketch by relying on my memory. If I'm looking at a photo, sometimes I'm bogged down into, at least design-wise, into some unimportant detail. So I will, use photographs to bring in some of the surface detail, you might say. Now here's some of my color I'm using. I'm using titanium white, cadmium yellow deep, and cadmium orange deep. Now here's some other colors I'm adding to my palette. And these are nickel titanate yellow, cadmium red light, and ultramarine blue. So those are some nice colors. And then here I'm using dioxazine purple and quinacridone violet. Those are going to be great to mix with my greens, and the purple also is a very deep color. Now here's my palette all laid out, and I've added a few extras. There's some titanium buff. It's kind of an off-white. And I also added some phthalo blue, which I'm using right now. I've also added some quin red. I also have some cobalt green there, and that's a great color. So I've had to, I've kind of rounded out my palette. So there I'm mixing some titanium white and some nickel titanate yellow, and adding just a little bit of red in there to kind of warm that up a little bit, and adding some white to lighten it up a little bit. So I'm obviously running out of titanium white here pretty quick, but I'll stop and refresh that palette. So in this, I'm not going to be using a lot of palette knife with my left hand in this video, because obviously I want to hold the palette up so that everyone can see it. But it is something I do, and I will use the palette knife a little bit later on. But I just wanted everybody to see the colors I'm mixing. Now I'm mixing up some color, believe it or not, for the sky, and I mixed some titanium white and some phthalo blue to get that. But I was mixing up the pink and the yellow to mix into this blue, this base of blue. There's just a little bit of ultramarine blue in this as well. I like to keep the colors, you can see right now I'm using the palette knife, and I'm trying to keep the colors pretty unmixed. There's a little bit of that pink color in there, and I just kind of mix that in, squish it down, and push out some of the blue that was on my palette knife. So if you add, if a sky is just blue, it looks really dead and flat, so you have to add quite a bit of pink in it, really. And some yellows are nice too. You can get a little bit of vibrational thing going with some greens and pinks. Now here's basically white and dioxazine purple. I want to kind of set that tone. I want to get that really dark note in there. And dioxazine purple is probably about the darkest color on my palette. And it's actually the darkest color I have, actually. So it's a nice color to kind of... Now there's some cobalt green, and it's a great green. You can tell I love it because it's almost gone, but I have enough for this painting. And you can mix it too. It's not like if you run out you can't mix it, but it's a very cool green, and it looks really fantastic with this purple. I also found the titanium, or the titanate, the nickel titanate yellow is a new color, and I hadn't really used it before, and it goes really well with that cobalt green too. I really loved it a lot. So those are kind of the three base colors for my greens, and I'll kind of just continue to fill in that purple. Now I've got a little bit of that cobalt green mixed in with the purple, and I'm just starting to mix a little bit with the palette knife. So I'm keeping a lot of the colors on my palette knife as I go from one color to another. I don't, clean it off with a tissue. So I'm just kind of skimming those across the top of that wet paint there, and it works really pretty good. You can start to see there's some value modification that's very slight. There I've mixed some of the nickel titanate yellow in there, and I also have some cadmium yellow deep, and I think I'm putting some in there too. I also have a little bit of yellow ochre. There's the color. Now I'm mixing some red, and that's just cad red. And I just want to warm that deeper shadow of the bush that's closer. So you want to have the bush that's closer be a warmer color than the tree in the back, obviously, and that will give you a sense of depth and dimension. Now you can use cool colors in the foreground, but it's going to take a little bit more finesse. So I do put some color, some blues into that later in this process, but I'm picking up a lot of the yellows and putting them in here. Now I've got a little bit of the cadmium yellow deep. There's some of the nickel titanate yellow mixing in there. Really loving that. The nickel titanate yellow is a very light value yellow, and so it has the effect almost of you could do this if you don't have this color. You can just use cadmium yellow light and mix in white with it, and the white will cool down the yellow, and it keeps it from getting too hot. Sometimes when I add yellows in, they'll get too hot, and it's just not really good. And I'm picking up some. I started to pick up some ultramarine blue, then shifted over to the phthalo blue, and that's a nice choice because you want to get a lot of complexity in your color. And picked up some purple too. And that purple, it just really looks great in that green. Now the reason that purple looks so great in a green is because it's got red in it. So it cools it down, but it also neutralizes. So if you just added pure purple like a phthalo or ultramarine blue, that green would be really high chroma and it would start to look very ugly. And that's one of the problems that many people make especially when they're starting to paint or when you're outside, is you just make your colors too high chroma. And I'm guilty of that myself at times, because you see that high chroma green and you just want it to be high chroma, and when you put it on in paint, it just screams and it doesn't look right. It looks kind of garish. So use a lot of red in your greens and you won't have that problem. So there I'm putting back in some purples, so I'm going to keep those apparently a little bit cooler. Then I added a little bit of straight blue, and that's great. You want some variety. You don't want to have that paint take on a monotonous surface quality. So that one red there is it's one of the Indian reds, and it's a very kind of earth tone, or kind of a ceramic tone, you might say, kind of the color of pottery. And it's a red with a lot of gray in it, so it's good to add. You won't lose control of that red very quickly. So I keep it on there. That's a nice chunk of warm. Now you can see I'm kind of pushing the brush around at different angles to get the paint to come off. Now I'm primarily using Gamblin paints, and Gamblin paints are pretty creamy. So, and what that means is that you can pick it up quickly off the palette, and you can deposit off your brush quite easily as well. So I can pick up a nice big clot of paint and get it to come off my brush. Now there's that cobalt green again. I'm squirting out some more on the palette because I just love it, and adding a little bit of the Indian red into it. Now you can see I accidentally got a little bit of white in there, and that is perfectly good. You don't want to mix those little paint anomalies out. You want to keep them in there, and you want to keep that diverse color mixture. Now, one thing I did was I made this reflection color darker and just a hair cooler than the color above it. So that keeps it so looking like it's reflecting off the water. Now, one thing to remember about reflected light is that every time it reflects off a surface, it goes down a notch in intensity, or energy level. So you lose a little bit of light energy. So it'll go down the spectrum, generally from warm colors to cool colors. So a reflected color off water is losing light energy, and so it's going to be just a little bit more bluish, a little darker. And that's a good rule of thumb you can use, and it just helps with a lot of things. I mean, light reflecting off rocks. I mean, just almost everything. Now, I've decided at this point I'm just going to obliterate those little wind patterns or whatever they are on the water, and I decided it's just too kind of linear. And even if I was going to paint them in like this, it would be better to paint them over the top. So, you don't. Otherwise, if you paint around these kind of very, sort of thin linear quality. There, I'm adding some more nickel titanate yellow onto the palette, so that obviously I want to add a little bit more light modulation, a little bit warmer color with the nickel titanate yellow. So you want to make sure that the modulation of color is cooler and darker, but it follows the same basic reflection, so that it looks right. So I've got a lot of that cool color, and I'm going to use that in the shadow in these poplars back here. So I just kind of lay that in. Now I'm pulling that brush up towards the sky because I want it to feather at the top. If I want, there I'm going down, so I want it to be a little bit more of a line on that one side. So I'm putting just a little bit of warmth on that color on that side. Then I want to feather that up just a hair, so I go up. I pull the brush into the paint, and generally the paint comes off thicker when on the attack, on the first strike of the paint to the canvas. It'll come off thick there, so that's where you get your nice lines. At the other end of the stroke, you get a nice blended effect. So I'm warming up my greens so much that they've actually become kind of grayish, and that's good. That's not a problem at all. I think that green, further back in the distance would be grayer. So it's a good choice. I got that green to go gray by just adding some red, either a bit of the Quin red, or either the cadmium red. So either one, just a little bit with that light green, I'll gray that out. So there, I think that's the Quin color, and not the cad, because it just looks darker. So it's going on dark, and I've just decided I needed that. Now I do go over this shortly with some nice greens. So this is kind of laying in that color complexity. Now you can see there I kind of had to fill in a little bit of the white little flecks, and that I wouldn't have to do if I had just put a wash of indigo blue over the top. And I think that would have been the thing to do. In retrospect, I think I would do that, so I didn't have to get so, particular about getting rid of all the white canvas. You can see there I've kind of ruined my shapes a little bit by, having to fill in all the white flecks. So that's one thing you can do, is you can have a little bit more spontaneity if your canvas doesn't have any white on it. I mean, that's just a rule of thumb. It's not always the case, but you can kind of just let yourself relax a little bit. Plus, it's nice to have just a medium value color on your canvas, so that you can really gauge your darks and light quite easily. Now here I'm trying to adjust the shadows so that they fit within the range of distance of this clump of vegetation. If I make the darks as dark as the foreground vegetation, it's going to bring those forward So, and I just pick up some darks and some lights here. I'm going to transfer those over to the other trees. I've kind of decided that I did make the darks a little too dark, so I need to bring up those lights a little bit. Sometimes you can pick up, paint elsewhere in your canvas and kind of redistribute it throughout, and that's a good way to get some unity going. Now I just added some purple to my base color there because I wanted that reflection to be very, very dark. So you always want to have your reflection darker than the object that it's reflecting off of. So I'm mixing up a little bit more of the lighter color. Now I did mix up some of that Quin Scarlet and put in there, and that's just going to warm that up just a hair. Actually, I think it's Quin Violet. Excuse me. I always get that mixed up. I think earlier I said I had Quin Red on my palette. I don't. It's the Quin Violet. So it's just a slightly more purple red, but still very much a red and a deeper, darker value. So I'm gonna start putting in the reflection of the kind of the little hill there, and now I am thinking that I'm going to put it in dark and then lighten it up. So in a few minutes here, I'll mix up some really kind of a reddish hue, pinkish dirt color, and put on there. So I'll pretty much obliterate this whole dark shape. But a lot of time it's good to get some hue underneath the color, and that can give that richness. And this is a cool color. I'm going to mix up some sky color with a little phthalo blue. Mix it in with some of the yellow that I've got there existing there. Warm it up a little bit. Add a little bit more of, I think that was the ultramarine. Yes, that is ultramarine. With some titanium white. Now I'm picking up some phthalo. And the phthalo, I think, to my eye, is a little bit warmer than the ultramarine blue. Now I'm picking up a little bit of the green. I want to just warm that up even more. So it's quite cool. It leans a little bit towards the green. So the sky is a lot lighter, as you can see. But again, you just want to have those values that are reflecting to be deeper and darker. And they would tend to get darker towards the end or the bottom of the canvas here. So I'll kind of work in a dark shape at the bottom and gradually get it lighter as I go up. Now I could have painted this all blue and then painted my reflection back into it as well. A lot of times it doesn't make a lot of sense to paint around shapes, but sometimes I just do it. So I'm going to mix up this kind of pinkish color that I mentioned earlier, and I'm actually gonna push it pretty far to the pink. I find that in this case I want to put the pink underneath and then put the greens over the top. Greens and tans. I'm cooling that down a little bit for the distant hills. For the distant hills, you want those colors to be really cool. I mean, you don't want them to get too hot or they'll pop forward. So I am going to mix that with the blues. So, keep them pretty grayed down. So adding, quite a bit of light into it too. You don't want to get it too dark, especially sometimes you can see the shadows in the distance as too dark, and that'll really make that pop forward too if you make them too dark. A shadow is at its darkest in the foreground and at its weakest in the distance. So in here I'm mixing up a little bit more of that pink color, and as I get it a little warmer, you can see it brings that shape forward. Now as I put in that pink, I'm kind of obliterating some of the variety in the contour of that bush. So that's one of the hazards. I'm focusing on the background and not really thinking about the tree, and so I lose some of the really interesting detail. Now I could have probably, and I often do paint from the far distance up to the middle ground, but I did, in this case, I wanted to put in those darker notes and then kind of work some of these lighter notes in around the dark area. And in this case, it worked quite nicely. The one thing is you do lose some of the silhouette, the contour of your shapes somewhat. I find it a little bit more logical to paint from distant to foreground. It seems just a little bit more logical. And here I'm mixing in a little bit more purple for the reflection, because I want that to be a lower light intensity, a little lower light energy. So, you put a little blue in that, and that sort of pushes that back. So, it's a good rule of thumb, but I mean, you don't want to, generally speaking, if you're painting outside, you want to paint what you see. In this case, I'm painting from memory, so I'm kind of relying a little bit on rules of thumb. But if you paint enough outside, or if you draw enough outside, you can, accumulate these sort of rules of thumb that can really greatly help you when you're in the studio. And I think it's almost better to draw or paint from memory than it is to draw or paint from photographs, because the photographs can give you a very distorted view of darks and reflected lights. So one thing, you don't always have to be painting to make observations of the natural world. I mean, if you have a commute or something and you're looking out the train window, you can make observations. You can observe. You can carry your value finder and make deductions on what's the darkest part of the scene, and it can be very interesting. It can teach you a lot. Now I decided that I needed to cool some of the areas up in the mountains or the foothills. This is almost like distant vegetation, you might say. It's kind of spotting along the hills. And I'm putting a few sky holes. I'm keeping my value shifts pretty similar. As I look at that shape in the distance, it does seem as though I've sort of made some of the values a little bit too distinct, and I need to kind of go in and simplify that. So, I mixed up a lighter color. The top of the hills will be getting that lighter, and you can kind of just drag the color on there and kind of mix the color that's on my brush with the color that's there, and again you do that by holding your brush a little bit more parallel to the canvas. If I held it more perpendicular or more straight into the canvas, it would tend to pick up the paint rather than to lay or pull off the paint off my brush. So I'm using a very deft stroke. Again, my paint's very creamy, and the creaminess of the paint facilitates the pulling off of the paint onto the canvas. Picking up a little bit of yellow ochre and some titanium white with a little Titan buff, and adding just a bit of cad red light into that. A little bit of the Titanate yellow. So that makes a pretty nice, very rich, kind of an earth tone. So, up close, I want that to be very warm, so it has a lot of yellows into it. The next one over, I would tend to add a little bit more red to it. So that would mean, adding some, either the cadmium red light or the quin violet. So, I picked up some gray color there, and that's good. I mean, it's nice to modulate your color. One thing that's boring is to have a bit of color that's just flat. Some people can handle that really well, But generally speaking, I like to have a stroke go from like a reddish tan to a yellow tan in the stroke. And the way you do that is you get a lot of color on your brush. You kind of load your brush up with a lot of different color. And then you pull it off with the texture of the canvas. Picking up some more of that tan. Just working it in there. Now my canvas is a little slack. I normally don't keep this canvas this slack. This was kind of a bargain canvas I picked up somewhere, and generally I like it a lot. Taunt, a little bit more, less give to it. Now I'm obliterating some of that blue of my underpainting, and I kind of wished I would have let some of that show through, and that's one of the hazards of not toning the entire canvas. I wouldn't be kind of struggling to kind of fill in those little white spots. But I think overall the blue is actually working pretty nice. And one thing you can do is just sort of you can experiment with the underpainting, and you can kind of find something that really works for you. One thing you don't want to just settle into kind of a formula. You want to use the underpainting that really makes this particular motif work. In this case, I think it's really, really working well, the blue. Here I'm mixing up a very light green and working it in the distance. One of the things you can do wrong is get too high chroma of a green. You want to keep your greens pretty gray. So I'll be working on keeping those greens, pretty gray here, and I will get them a little bit too high chroma, too high saturation, and then I will go back in and gray them out. And that can be a good solution too. Sometimes you don't want to think of the color you lay down as a mistake. Sometimes it's great to just lay a color over the top of it, and it can be very successful. In other words, you don't want to think of the paint you apply as necessarily being a failure if you can put down a color over the top of it that will work together. So, rarely do colors exist, on their own. They're always in relationship to the color that's right next to it or the color underneath it. Now, these are called field effects, and you can go to my blog and type in field effects in the search feature there, and we'll get a few articles on that. And it's really a great thing to know in order to get, that vibrational kind of thing going that the Impressionists really used a lot, and many other painters. Really, Delacroix definitely used the same technique, really. So as I look at this green, as I lay it down, I do think it's a little too high chroma. I mean, it looks a little bit too much like the felt on a billiard table or something, very, very rich green. And that can be very effective sometimes. This scene with some of the distant mountains and things, it sort of belies that kind of rich green. So I don't think it's necessarily working with this, motif. But I'll fix that eventually. Just mixing up some light tan, using some the nickel titanate yellow and some just a touch of yellow ochre and titanium white. And I use the palette knife here to just get a little bit more, robust, a little bit more chaotic layer of paint. I felt like that layer of green was a little bit too, you might say prim, or a little too controlled. So you kind of want to surrender some of that control. And of course, that it takes a lot of practice to surrender control. Ironically, you have to practice it, and you have to kind of know where you're headed with it. But it is a good solution. Sometimes you can overwork a section and you can fix it very, very quickly by mixing up a small bit of paint on a palette knife and just pushing it onto the paint that's existing there. So It takes some practice with the palette knife. I have to say I'm much more adept with a brush than I am with a palette knife. But it's something that I think is best if you just kind of dive in and start. You're trying your best to learn how to do it. And you'll get that kind of virtuosity, or that ability to handle the pigment and put it where you want it, with time. So here I'm kind of cooling down some of the areas of the green. I just felt like it was getting a little hot, and so I needed to cool it down just a little bit. Adding some sky holes with the palette knife. I think the palette knife just has a kind of a nice random quality, and then you can go back in and you can sort of finesse those strokes with the brush. So you get the best of both worlds. You get a nice chaotic bit of color, and then you can soften an edge, or you can blend with the brush. But overall, I think it's best to have a nice fusion of strokes of both brushwork and palette knife. Sometimes if a painting is done with exclusive palette knife work, it can have kind of a facile, or you might say a cheesy kind of a quality that can be a little bit off-putting. So I do warn people about that, but everybody's taste is different, so it's hard to really and I wouldn't want to give a formula for how to combine brushwork with palette knife work. But if I think a lot of my early work where I used exclusive brushes, things started to have a little bit too much roundness and sort of had kind of a mushy or soft quality. And with the palette knife, I was able to bring back a little bit of the harder edge to some of my shapes, and this really helped me to give a sense of verisimilitude to the scenes. Of course, reality isn't necessarily what we want to go after here, but what I mean is that you get a diversity of edges, and that can really be very beautiful. I think diversity is one of the things that really gives beauty to any landscape, any painting. So if you get a uniformity of stroke, I think that's really where you get that kind of facile or cheesy kind of a feel to a painting, is because everything has this kind of monotony to it. So you really want to avoid that at all costs. So this is the first phase of the painting, and I'm just kind of like adding a few little details here and there, little few sky holes. I call them sky holes, and it's just the light from the distance coming through. In this case, it's mountains. And adding a few light areas, just trying to simplify a little bit.